Psalm 5. There's a few more of you in here than for our Bible class, so I want to repeat again how excited I am to be here and thankful I am for the invitation. I got to tell you, I'm probably more at ease in this pulpit than I am most others, and that is because I have probably subjected this church to some of the worst sermons that have ever been preached in this pulpit very early on when I started preaching. And you responded to those, I distinctly remember, with nothing but patience and grace and maybe a little bit of forgiveness. So I set the bar really low. All I have to do is do better than that, and I know you'll be okay with it. Let's start in Psalm 5, beginning in verse 1. Psalm 5, beginning in verse 1. Give ear to my words, O Lord. Consider my groaning. Give attention to the sound of my cry, my King and my God, for to you do I pray. O Lord, in the morning you hear my voice. In the morning I prepare a sacrifice for you and watch. For you are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil may not dwell with you. The boastful shall not stand before your eyes. You hate all evildoers. You destroy those who speak lies. The Lord abhors the bloodthirsty and deceitful man. But I, through the abundance of your steadfast love, will enter your house. I will bow down towards your holy temple in the fear of you. Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness because of my enemies. Make your way straight before me. For there is no truth in their mouth. Their inmost self is destruction. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongue. Make them bear their guilt, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels. Because of the abundance of their transgressions, cast them out, for they have rebelled against you. But let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them ever sing for joy and spread your protection over them, that those who love your name may exult in you. For you bless the righteous, O Lord. You cover him with favor as with a shield. Let me begin this morning by asking if you are a morning person. I will answer for myself, no. Do you ever have those Sunday mornings where you're just not feeling it? Maybe you don't. You know, maybe you're the person who, you wake up every morning at 4 a.m., raring to go, and by the time 9:30 on Sunday morning rolls around, you've already prepared and eaten a full breakfast and watched the sun rise on your hour-long morning walk and spent another hour in meditative contemplation getting ready for worship. Do you know these people? If you're that person, I have delivered a message to deliver you from the rest of us. What the rest of us want to tell you is, we don't want to hear about it, okay? We're not being ugly. We're just jealous because our Sunday mornings are not usually like that. We are tired and we've had a long week and getting ready isn't always so smooth. The version of that at my house, we've got a 3-year-old and a nearly 1-year-old, and our Sunday mornings are usually full of crying and fussing and whining, and that's just me. All right. More seriously though, Sunday mornings are tough for people because they wake up Sundays hurting. The fact that it's the Lord's Day doesn't magically change everything about that. Some of our older members, no doubt, hurt physically every morning. It's tough for them to get out of bed every day, including Sunday. Some come hurting emotionally, dealing with profound sadness and profound loss, that they're working through things they haven't even been able to express in words. Some have a hard time Sunday morning because they barely slept as a result of stress at home, in their marriage, or something happening with one of their kids. Some have a hard time Sunday because they're battling with temptation and sin and the guilt and shame that come along with those things. Life can be so hard, and that doesn't magically fix itself because it's Sunday. And I think Psalm 5 has something to say about these tough Sunday mornings. First thing to notice about this psalm is its setting. The setting of the psalm is morning as David awakes and prepares for worship. So in verse 3, he is using the morning to prepare a sacrifice for God. In verse 7, he's entering God's house and bowing down in worship. And in verse 11, he's singing with the congregation. It is a psalm about waking up on the Lord's Day. And it is a psalm, we will notice, that opens with a groan and ends with a song. Now, let me get this out at the beginning. I am fully aware that Sundays are the Christian day of worship. I'm not the Jewish. David wouldn't have thought of Sunday, the first day of the week, as that day, but I'm adapting David's words to our Christian context. So I want us to think this morning about what we should do when Sunday mornings are tough. I think this psalm has a lot of valuable encouragement to give us. The first thing is this: when Sunday mornings are tough, come groan to God. Verse 1 again. Give ear to my words, O Lord. Consider my groaning. Give attention to the sound of my cry, my King and my God. For to you do I pray. O Lord, in the morning you hear my voice. In the morning I prepare a sacrifice for you and watch. The Psalms often refer to the time of day. And in particular, they seem to focus on those times of day when we are alone with our thoughts and worries. They talk about what is happening before the day begins, or as it's coming to a close and our work is done, or in the sleepless dead of night. So for an example of a different time of day the Psalms speak of, Psalm 4 is often called an evening psalm. Psalm 4 in verse 8 shows us why. In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. That's often called an evening psalm. Easy to see why. By contrast, Psalm 5 is often called a morning psalm. Verse 3 again, O Lord, in the morning you hear my voice. So we are to imagine David waking up in the morning. And in these opening verses, there is obviously something on his mind. He has got stresses. He has got worries this morning. And we'll talk about what those might have been later in the sermon. But basically, he wakes up remembering and realizing that he has all the same problems that he had when he went to bed the night before. They didn't just magically go away like we all hoped they would. I want us to notice the progression of words David uses to describe what he's doing this morning before God. So in verse 1, the word there is groaning. Now, my version translates it groaning. It's translated meditating in the New King James Version. But most literally, that word there that's translated is used to describe making a low, indistinct sound. A bit like the one you probably made when you got out of bed this morning. Groan. So verse 1, he's groaning. In the first half of verse 2, he's doing something else. He's crying. He's crying out to God. Give attention to the sound of my cry. In the second half of verse 2 and in verse 3, now he's doing something else. He's praying. He's voicing words to the Lord. To you do I pray. In the morning you hear my voice. I am not the first person to notice that there is a progression from David groaning to the Lord and then growing a little more distinct into a cry, into finally a more articulate prayer. To put it simply, David is describing the process of waking up. And as David wakes up on this morning, he has two thoughts. Number one, the worries and concerns that are making him groan. And number two, the fact that he needs to bring those worries and concerns and groans to God. David wakes up with problems, and the first thing he knows he needs to do is tell God about his problems. Verse 2, give attention to the sound of my cry, my King and my God, for to you do I pray. And as David is gradually waking up, getting a little more articulate about his concerns, he's doing something else as well in verse 3. He is preparing. In the morning, I prepare a sacrifice for you and watch. He's getting ready to worship in the law of Moses' way. He is bringing a sacrifice, preparing to bring a sacrifice to the tabernacle. And he says, as I do that, I watch. It's a word about anxious anticipation. It means that as David voices his concerns to God, he is anxiously anticipating what God will have to say in response. And so he says in these opening verses, I woke up today groaning, but groaning to God about my worries, readying myself for worship, readying myself to hear God's answer to my groans. I think I can confidently say from these verses, David was not that mythical person who's waking up at 4 a.m. raring to go. Now, I know in another psalm he says, I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. But at least I don't think he started this day saying that. He started this day with a groan. He begins the day with a groan, remembering all the things he was worried sick about the night before. But that's not all he does. He expresses them to God. He gives voice to them in prayer. He asks God to hear his groans. And he wakes up making preparations to worship. And what I want to say here is that this is some sort of a pattern for God's people to follow. Because too often what we do is wake up groaning, and then we let those groans keep us away from God. We are so eaten up with the stresses and worries of our life and how we can fix them and what we have to get done that we forget to tell the only one who can actually do something about them. That we so fixate on the things we have to get done, we forget to include the God from whom all blessings flow. What I want to say in the beginning of this psalm is this: don't let the things that make you groan in the morning keep you from God. Bring those with you to God in prayer and in worship. And if all you can muster this morning is a groan, David would tell us that's a good start. All this talk about groaning reminds me of another text in Romans 8 and verse 26 where Paul says, "We do not know what to pray as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words." That is, God can make sense of our groans. He welcomes our groans as long as we're coming to him, bringing ourselves before him. When Sunday mornings are tough, David says, come groan to God. Number two, when Sunday mornings are tough, don't let the enemy keep you from worship. So picking up in verse 4, we learn what David must have been groaning about as he awoke this day, or get some sense of it. Verse 4, "For you are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil may not dwell with you. The boastful shall not stand before your eyes. You hate all evildoers. You destroy those who speak lies. The Lord abhors the bloodthirsty and deceitful man. But I, through the abundance of your steadfast love, will enter your house. I will bow down towards your holy temple in the fear of you. Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness because of my enemies. Make your way straight before me. For there is no truth in their mouth. Their inmost self is destruction. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongue. Make them bear their guilt, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels. Because of the abundance of their transgressions, cast them out, for they have rebelled against you." In a word, David's problem this morning is enemies. Their identity here is not made clear. If I had to guess, and that's all this is, I guess this is in the time when David is already king, sitting on the throne, and there is political opposition to his rule. And there are several stories that fit that description. That perhaps people are questioning his anointed status and casting aspersions on his legitimacy as king. Notice, as we talked about in our Bible class, the main weapons they're employing are not sticks and stones, not swords, but words. Verse 9 again, there is no truth in their mouth. The second half of the verse, their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongue. They're using all the instruments of speech, the mouth, the throat, and the tongue, to try to destroy David. They lie. They know who to flatter. Their throat is an open grave. That is, their words are full of rot and uncleanness and corruption. They will say and do whatever they have to in order to discourage and tear down and humiliate and undermine David. And because David is so affected by these naysayers, by these detractors, as he certainly is, it is very likely that they are gaining in numbers and influence. You know, when a president has a 90% approval rating, he is not worried about the other 10%. They're the ones who will hate him no matter what. That if he saved a kitten from a burning building, they would be the ones to complain that he didn't run fast enough. But when he has a 10% approval rating, he is very worried because it means people are listening to his detractors. David seems to be in that situation. He is very worried about the things being said about him. But amidst this opposition from his enemies, as discouraged and despondent as he may have been, David reminds himself that God sees their evil and will judge it. Verse 4, "You are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil may not dwell with you. The boastful shall not stand before your eyes. You hate all evildoers. You destroy those who speak lies. The Lord abhors the bloodthirsty and deceitful man." He also reminds himself in verse 7 that just as God sees the hearts of the evil, he also sees his own heart. His heart that loves and trusts God, verse 7. "But I, through the abundance of your steadfast love, will enter your house. I will bow down toward your holy temple in the fear of you." God is never fooled. He sees straight through everyone. He is never fooled by the devices and cover-ups of evil men. David in these verses even calls on God to render judgment on these enemies. In verse 10, "Make them bear their guilt, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels. Because of the abundance of their transgressions, cast them out, for they have rebelled against you." It is important to say, David is not trying to use God as his henchman. Please notice, he doesn't call on God's judgment because they've rebelled against David, but because they've rebelled against God. Verse 10, "They have rebelled against you." Also notice that he calls on God to enact justice on them. He doesn't put himself in God's place to enact his own vengeance. That is, God, do to them what they deserve to have done to them. And so he's calling on God throughout the psalm. Do something about it. See through their evil. Do something about it. But David also says what he will do in the meantime, as he waits on God to act. In verse 7, "I, through the abundance of your steadfast love, will enter your house." That's what David will do. Motivated by God's love and grace, David says, "I'm going to God's house. Amidst those who hate me, I will go take refuge in the one who steadfastly loves me." There is an eagerness an exuberance to David's words in verse 7, that he cannot wait to enter God's house, to find refuge there, to be among those who love God. But he also says in the second half of verse 7, I will bow down toward your holy temple in the fear of you. There's an interesting balance here between an eagerness in the first half of verse 7 to enter God's house, but also with a reverence, a fear as he enters that house at the second half of the verse. It's almost as if he wants to run to the tabernacle, to wrap his arms around God, but he has to sort of slow himself down as he approaches, to bow down in reverence. It reminds me of a story I read about a painter who made a beautiful life-size painting of a boy carrying a basket of grapes on his head. And the painting was so true to life that when it was displayed, birds actually got in and started pecking at the grapes because they thought they were real. And the painter was praised for this work. What an amazing piece of art. But he said, I should have done even better. I should have painted the boy so true to life that the birds wouldn't have dared come near the grapes. And I think that's a good summary of verse 7, of David's mindset in worship. So captivated by God's love, he's drawn to God's house. Nothing keeps him away. But at the same time, so deeply reverent and sobered by a fear of God, he wouldn't dare approach God in any position except bowed down on his face. Now, David doesn't actually get to much of a request or a petition in the psalm until about verse 8, when he says, Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness. Because of my enemies, make your way straight before me. David asks to be led in righteousness, that he will be led down the right path from here on. That is, help me do the right thing, even as I'm surrounded and hounded by people doing wrong things. The New Testament equivalent would be a part of Jesus' model prayer. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So here's David's situation. He has got problems. He has got enemies who want him deposed or dead. And he wakes up this morning groaning with every reason in the world to say, not today. No worship for me today. Next week, maybe things will calm down and then we'll do it. But instead of letting the enemy discourage him from worshiping God, he brings those groans to God in worship in verse 7. And this is part of our problem. Often problems and difficulties keep us away from church. We let them keep us away from worshiping with God's people. We sort of go to ground when there's anything wrong in our lives. We're like an ostrich who puts his head underground at the first sign of trouble. What we need to see is that these are the times in particular when we need God the most, when we need to worship the most, when we need God's people the most. In fact, God has specifically designed the church to be a place for hurting people. It's all over the New Testament. In Romans 12, Paul says that the church is supposed to be a place where we love one another with brotherly affection, contribute to the needs of the saints, rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. God envisions the church as a place where the needs and tears of its members are shared with one another. You've got tears, you've got needs, come to church and bring them. See, but the church can't be that, can't do that if our needs and tears are things that keep us away from church. We can't fulfill Romans 12. In Galatians 6, Paul says the church is supposed to be a place where if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness, bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. He says the church is supposed to be a place of the confession of sin, and a place of forgiveness, and a place of bearing burdens. But you see, that can only happen if we're willing to cast our burdens on our brethren. You can't do Romans 6 unless you come to church, groans and all. Ephesians 4, the church is supposed to be a place where we are kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave us. We're prepared to dispense kindness, tender-heartedness, and forgiveness to those who come to worship anyway, groans and all. I want you to consider this. When we let our hardships, when we let our hurts, when we let our cares keep us away from God and God's people, how pleased is the enemy, our enemy? How pleased is he? Has not Satan accomplished his mission? Bringing things into our lives which keep us away from God? But when our hardships, when our hurts, when our cares actually do the opposite, when they drive us toward God, when they drive us toward God's people, now how pleased is the enemy? He pitches a fit because we've done the exact opposite he hoped would happen. The point, David says, don't let the enemy win. Don't let the enemy keep you from worship. So let me tease this out a little bit more. Please do not let your work stresses keep you from worship. Come sing songs of praises to God and maybe tell a brother or sister, a trusted brother or sister, about those stresses. The point is, come, bring it here. Please do not let difficulty at home keep you from worship. Come and get the encouragement God is trying to give you for those things here. Please do not let difficult and unanswered spiritual or moral questions keep you from worship. Please come where we study the Scriptures together and by all means ask someone. And please do not let the shame and guilt of sin keep you from worship. Come hear the gospel message of forgiveness that frees us from the shame and guilt of sin as we experience forgiveness from it. I want to say this next part more than once, because if you get nothing else from the sermon, please get this. Dealing with all of these issues are not interruptions to the church's work. Dealing with issues like these is the church's work. Let me say that again. Dealing with these headaches and heartaches, these are not interruptions to the church's work. Dealing with these things is the church's work. Please don't believe the enemy's lies. It is a lie of Satan that says you have to have it all together before you're allowed to come to church. That's a lie of Satan. Please don't let him keep you away from God's people. David didn't let his enemies keep him away. Which brings us to number 3, third and finally. Come experience the fellowship of your brethren. What I really want us to notice is how the psalm begins and ends in radically different settings. Verse 11, but let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them ever sing for joy and spread your protection over them, that those who love your name may exult in you. For you bless the righteous, O Lord. You cover him with favor as with a shield. The psalm begins in verse 1 with the lonely groans of a man in the morning, the result of enemies discouraging him and lying about him. But while the psalm opens that way, it ends in verse 11 with a joyful song in the company of God's people. It opens with a groan and ends with a song. And how did that happen? How did it get from one to the other? Just follow the psalm. It is because in verse 3, David rolled out of bed and prepared his sacrifices. It is because in verse 7, he entered God's house that he now finds himself in the company of all those who take refuge in you, O God. And now at the end of the psalm, he is joining with his fellow worshipers in song. And together they experience God's spread of protection over them. Verse 12, together those who love your name exult in you. But I want you to imagine, if in verse 1, David simply stayed at home, groaning alone. If he never, in verse 3, got up to prepare his sacrifice, if he never, in verse 7, entered God's house, he would have never experienced the refuge and joy and songs and protection and love that he finds at the end of the psalm. As God's people worship together, he would still be in verse 1, at home, groaning alone. There's a man in the Bible who did that. He went off by himself to groan alone. I'm thinking of Elijah. He went into the wilderness in 1 Kings 19. He put himself in self-imposed isolation. As a result, Elijah started doubting that there were actually any of God's people left beside him. He too had enemies like David. Ahab and Jezebel wanted him dead. He let them drive him away from God's people. And he's sitting out in the wilderness under the tree. And God has to tell him, Elijah, get up. He has to tell him more than once. He has to tell him, Elijah, you're not the only one. I have plenty who haven't bowed the knee to Baal, but you'd never know it since you're out here by yourself groaning alone. See, Elijah needed what David needed, and we need what both of them did, to experience the fellowship of worshiping God together as God's people. Because it is a lot harder to sit around and groan that life is so hard and I'm in this alone when you're busy singing praises alongside God's people who love him and who love you. We need to get up from under the tree in the wilderness like Elijah. We need to roll out of bed like David. We need to bring our groans to the house of God, because when you get there, you will find inevitably the help and encouragement God is trying to give you. Now, one thing I need to tack on here. I'm preaching on and on about, coming to worship, even in our low and difficult moments, and how we'll leave better off than when we came. Of course, all of this assumes that the rest of us are also here. It assumes that the rest of us are ready to listen empathetically to the groans of our brethren. It assumes we are prepared to offer encouragement, not mere platitudes. And it assumes, most difficult, that we're ready to restore and forgive sinners who confess. Shame on us if a brother or sister tries to emulate David, but comes to the house of God only to find haphazard worship, superficial relationships, a lack of brotherly love, and an unwillingness to forgive or bear burdens. The point is, though, come experience the fellowship of your brethren. This is how God, in large part, is trying to help you with your groans. So we all have those tough Sunday mornings where we're just not feeling it. David does. But the solution to the tough Sunday morning is not to put God off for another time. It is to partake in what he's trying to give you to help what's making your morning tough. And if all you can muster some Sunday mornings is a groan, then come groan to God. But whatever you do, don't let the enemy keep you from worship. Don't let the devil successfully keep you from this place. Come experience the joy and fellowship of worshiping God together with your brethren. That's what David does in this psalm, and that's what makes all the difference. See, if we wait to come to worship only when all the stars align, only when everyone in the house gets a full 12 hours of sleep the night before, only when there's domestic bliss, only when there's nothing wrong in our lives, we could probably tentatively schedule our next worship service for probably about never. But of course, God has not designed the church to be a place where only people with perfectly starched clothing are allowed to come. Only people with no problems and perfect marriages and perfect children and never ever sin. That's not what the church is. As has often been said, the church, one way to think of the church is as a support group for sinners. That worship is for people who are hurting and struggling, who can only muster groans in the morning. But if we're doing it right, you'll find it that on those tough Sunday mornings, when you make it to God's house like David did, you'll be glad you came. That like David, the day that starts with the groan in verse 1 can end with a song in verse 11. Let me just be very clear as we wrap up what my intentions are in the sermon, exactly what it is I'm saying. I am not telling you in the sermon you should come to worship even if you don't feel like it. That's not what I'm saying. Rather, I am saying you should come to worship especially when you don't feel like it. And so I suppose we should ask, what is your groan this morning? What do you need to express so that we can help you bear that burden? That is in large part what we're here for. Please tell someone what's making your morning tough. It can be right now. It can be publicly. It doesn't have to be now. It doesn't have to be publicly. But by all means, tell someone. Pull someone aside. Talk to the elders. Talk to me. But we do offer the invitation now to anyone that needs to come and let the church be the church to dispense kindness and empathy and forgiveness. If there's anyone that needs to seek that, maybe some Christian who's fallen and needs help getting up. Maybe there's someone who needs to put on Christ in the first place, to bring all the groans of the life lived in the world, bring those before God, to have Him forgive those sins, washing them away in the waters of baptism. Whatever your spiritual need, come forward now as we stand and sing to encourage you.